Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see all of these wonderful faces in the audience, some new friends and not as new friends. And thank you for joining us for this session, Ending the Drudgery, Balancing the Burden of Unpaid Work. For those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet, my name is Emily Corey Pryor. Oh my gosh, I can't even say my own name right now. It is the last day of Women Deliver, y'all. It's hard to talk now. So my name is Emily Corey Pryor, and I run Data 2X, which is a global gender data alliance. We are committed to ensuring an increase in both more and better gender data production, analysis, and use specifically in terms of better decision making and better policy making to benefit women and girls and really all of us. And so this topic of unpaid care work and understanding the size and shape and nature of unpaid care work is extremely important to us. And I'm really delighted to be doing this session with all of these lovely women here who I will be introducing shortly. But just to kind of give you an overview of what this session is about, we're really going to be, and the reason that these wonderful speakers were asked to join us is that we're going to be exploring solutions that are out there right now. We don't want to just talk about problems, we want to talk about solutions too. Exploring solutions to reduce women's double burden of unpaid care work and paid activities and boost their economic prospects. So we really are trying to pinpoint interventions that are proven to work and that have potential to scale. So we're going to be hearing about new evidence on what works to shift unpaid care work norms, as well as some innovative both policy sector and private sector interventions. So before we get too much underway, I want to just kind of give you the shape of how we're going to run this session. So first thing we're going to be doing is that we're going to have an icebreaker quiz, because who doesn't love a good icebreaking quiz? And we're gonna be using Slido, which I'm just gonna show my age, I guess, that I didn't really know what Slido was until now, but apparently it's not that hard. So I'm going to be very empowered myself during this session. So we're going to have an icebreaking quiz on Slido, and then we're going to be jumping into, of course, our panel discussion, and then we really are working hard to ensure that we have ample time for Q&A at the end. So be thinking about your Q&A. And if I'm not wrong, I think in addition to icebreaking with Slido, we're also going to be utilizing Slido for questions too, right? For logging some questions. Can somebody give me an indication that I'm correct on that? Okay. So we're also going to be doing that. So as we're going through, kind of keep those in mind and enter those on Slido as well. So, first, I'm guessing most people in this room are operating from the same definition of unpaid care work, but just to ensure that we are, since some people are joining sessions where they're learning something new, which is always nice. We're thinking about that as including cooking, cleaning, caring for children, the ill, and the elderly. And unpaid care work, as I think probably most of us know, is mostly undertaken by women and girls, and usually within households. Although, as we also know, it can also take place outside of households as well. This is by no means to say that men and boys do not do unpaid care work. They do, but it is less than women and girls globally, as well as within many countries. I think every country, and it's also different types of jobs. As we think about the ways that economies are going to be shifting in future years, the care burden is really likely to be increasing. Just looking at the demographics around the world, the care burden is likely to increase in the coming years with aging populations, where people are living longer and yet also in poorer health. So really a key challenge within unpaid care work is the failure to sufficiently measure it, understand it, value it, and then take actions, policy interventions, programmatic interventions, private sector interventions to address it. And this is really critical from an economic and social perspective. So, what do we know? One of the things that I was asked to do from a moderator standpoint was, kind of understand or at least set the stage for a bit of what we do know about the extent of women and girls' unpaid care work. And in several countries, time use data has been hugely important for understanding that. Now, not every country does a time use survey. I'm well aware of that. I'm sure many of you here are as well. But it is a critically important tool that can be used in order to really shed more light and measure the extent of unpaid care work. We so although we have time use data in some settings, and although there's a lot of really interesting work going on time use data, we really still, the reality is we lack global comparable data to assess both the type and the magnitude of unpaid work conducted by women, but also to measure the distribution of this type of work within households and the extent of gender inequality within households. And so with some of the partners that we work, and some of them are here in this room, we work closely with the Ilo Statistics Department. The Ilo has been quite a leader on unpaid care and understanding kind of both the data implications, but the interaction with policy levers as well as with the UN Statistics Division. We've been working at Data 2X to improve the quality and availability of comparable time use data around the world to try to help highlight this burden of unpaid work. One of the things we did, and I'm only mentioning this not to give a promo for my own stuff, but actually is more because of all of my colleagues here who I think have also left things, many of them at the back. Make sure you check out that back table. We did a global study on time use studies that exist and trying to understand the interaction that the availability of time use data had on policy action or policy inaction. So that might be a really useful tool for you. And I'm hoping that my colleagues will also be highlighting some of their own work and pointing you to resources that are at the back. So I hope that we can have a really amazing conversation. Maybe there can be some controversy. We'll see. You never know. But I hope we can have a really productive conversation about unpaid care, the interaction with the kind of data that we need, as well as the kind of interventions and solutions that we can be building utilizing that data and that learning. So before we get started, as I promised, we are going to have our Slido. I'm going to learn about that. And we really want to take a moment to hear from you with this survey. So you first go, the number's still on there. So you go to slido.com on your phones or your laptop and enter the code. I didn't bring my phone up here. We're not participating in this quiz. Okay. And we're going to just ask you to fill out 3 quick questions about yourself, your unpaid work burden, and what you think about different solutions. Just giving people a moment. Well, this one's probably fairly quick to answer. Can I get like a thumbs up? One at a time? One question at a time. Okay, so you have to do one question at a time. Can I get a thumbs up? Are people able to get on this? Are people doing this? Okay, thank you. See, I said it would be interactive. Raise your hand. Next time I'm gonna ask you to raise the opposite hand of the one that you just raised. Okay, I think we can move on to the next question. Okay. On an average weekday, how many hours do you estimate that you spend on unpaid care and domestic work? This question is making me not feel very empowered. Just makes you think about your daily life. I'm thinking about all the hours of unpaid work that are ahead of me when I get home, of the things I've not been doing this week. Now that I'm seeing this, it would have been really interesting to have a demographic breakdown of like what is the shape within your household, right? So what's the age distribution in the room and child distribution as well. This one's still kind of sliding around. I can't tell if people are done with this one. It's still moving. Okay, while it's still moving, can we all answer this question? Can I just put you on the spot? Sonia?
2 to 4.
2 to 4, okay. Thalia?
Yes, I think it's 1 to 2 now.
Okay.
When I had kids at home, it was definitely 2 to 4.
Yeah.
Probably less than 1 hour.
Okay, good for you.
Yeah, I'd have to say maybe an hour or, between an hour, 1 to 2 or an hour less.
All right, yeah. I'm probably around the 4 mark myself, maybe right now. Kids are little. Mm-hmm. All right, great. So I'm going to move on. Other hand, thumbs up of people are done. Okay, awesome. Great, last question. Of the following, what would be the most transformative for your unpaid care work burden? Choose one. Good question, Anne. That was a good question. Just one. Thumbs up. Okay, so we're good. Well, thank you. All right, excellent. So now we're gonna look at results, which is so fun. I don't know if these will be a surprise to anyone or not, but so for the first question, can we put the results up? Does that happen in any kind of overarching way?
There we go.
Okay, all right. So we are an overwhelmingly female room, not a surprise necessarily at Women Deliver. So 93% female, 7% male, no folks who identify as trans, non-binary, or two-spirit. We can go to the next one. Okay, on an average weekday. Wow, so we have a split somewhere between 1 to 4 hours. And then some 4 to 6 hours. Oh, I would love to dig into that number, but okay. In the Q&A, if people are open to talking about the 4 to 6 hours, I would love to hear from someone during Q&A on that. Okay, and our last one, changing restrictive norms around redistribution of care and domestic work comes out on top, as well as, although, quite a few percentage points away on subsidized public or public childcare and services, which obviously those two interact greatly with each other in terms of how we're prioritizing government spending and other things. Well, great. I really thank you all for participating in that, and maybe we can revisit and talk some about the interaction among some of those factors when we get to the Q&A. This exercise was really just meant to kind of, first of all, get you involved in the discussion, but also really get everyone thinking about a few things. So your own unpaid care work and time use burden, as well as the types of solutions that you might see or identify for yourself of how that could transform the burden that you experience. So with that, I'm really excited to turn to our panel of experts to dig into this conversation. So I asked them in the speaker prep call, I said, do you want to introduce yourselves or do you want me to introduce you? And I think we decided that I would introduce you. It's easier for me to brag about you than for you to brag about yourselves. But I'm really happy to introduce immediately to my left Sonia Laszlo, who is Associate Professor of Economics at McGill University. Her research expertise is in applied microeconomic analysis and economic development. So we'll be hearing from her about a case of childcare in Nairobi and how the lack of access to childcare can be a barrier to labor force engagement. Next, we have Thalia Kidder, and Thalia is the strategic lead for Oxfam's We Care program, including developing the rapid care analysis exercises for development programs and advocacy on unpaid care and domestic work. It's called the Household Care Survey and social norms research. She will be telling us about the achievements of the Philippines We Care program, running in Mindanao and Visayas since 2014. Next, we have Maria Padilla-Romo, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Tennessee. Maria's research includes applied microeconomics, public economics, and development economics, and she'll be sharing with us the case of full-time school programs in Mexico and its impact on decent work for care workers. And last, we have our colleague Sandra Fontano, who is Global Partnerships Manager at Unilever, which she and her team have been leading Unilever's efforts on unpaid care work. Sandra will be sharing her perspective on private sector engagement in unpaid care work. As you can see, there's, nobody up here is really qualified at all to talk about this topic. This is not an illustrious group of people, not at all. No, we're really excited about this. So I'm going to dive right into some questions that we've prepared. So I'm going to start with Sonia. So Sonia, can you tell us what your research in Nairobi was really aiming to answer and how it was carried out? What were some of the findings on childcare solutions? And also I would love to hear about whether or not there was data on unpaid care work at that time that you were able to use in the work in Nairobi.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I'm going to start with setting the setting. Imagine that you're a mother of a young child in one of Nairobi's informal settlements. You might have just recently gotten there from the countryside, leaving behind your extended network of family and friends, potential caregivers, or maybe you've been there for a while, but everybody around you is busy because everybody's trying to make ends meet. And so, there's this question of how do you balance this issue of taking care of your children while working or even going out to look for work. So your ability to find regular and reliable work will depend on your ability to find safe and reliable place to leave your child. And of course, we very well know that lack of access to affordable childcare, just as much in Korogocho, one of the slums in Nairobi, as it is here in North America and around the world, it's really a barrier to your ability to find good work. And in fact, in the Kenyan case, nationally, the gender gap in labor force participation between men and women is about 10%. And to what extent is lack of access to childcare a large explanatory factor for that? And so that's what we went about to try to explore. So this was research that was funded by Canada's International Development Research Centre. This was a collaborative effort between McGill University and the African Population Health Research Centre, APHRC. And so we set out to understand and to the extent possible quantify this trade-off between work and childcare. So what did we do? We ran a randomized control trial in which we provided a random sample of mothers with young children, no cost access to one of 48 childcare centers in Korogocho. Thanks to an ongoing demographic surveillance survey run by APHRC, in which they enumerate all residents in this particular settlement every 4 months, which is amazing. Wow. We had a fairly accurate picture of how many mothers resided in the neighborhoods and also how many children resided there. And in particular, we were focusing on mothers with children aged 1 to 3. So we surveyed 1,200 of these mothers, and of these, 2/3 were randomly selected to receive vouchers for fully subsidized childcare. We did not, however, have reliable data on childcare centers or on childcare use, so we needed to collect this data ourselves in order to design the intervention. After the intervention, so a year later, we returned to do a follow-up survey, and we collected baseline and end-line data on socioeconomic characteristics of the mother, her children, her household, and in particular, labor market outcomes. We were especially interested in her ability to work for pay, and also how much she was working and how much she was earning. So the 48 childcare centers that were selected for the study were all located within the Korogocho settlement, but we only kept, of the 48, we met a certain basic minimum standard for quality and safety in particular. So because 30% of mothers in the study were already using childcare at baseline, we randomly assigned childcare centers into 3 arms: control centers that didn't receive any intervention, voucher centers, and voucher plus quality improved centers. So the voucher centers received an unrestricted amount of money, a small amount of money, to ensure that they could absorb this additional number of children that would join their centers. And the voucher plus quality improved centers received training on early childhood education that was provided by the Aga Khan Foundation, along with additional materials such as mattresses, potties, and toys. So what did we find? At baseline, close to 60% of mothers in our study were already working. And we estimated that childcare costs in Korogocho would account for approximately 17% of her earnings on average. So that's giving you a sense of how large this expense is. At Endline, after the intervention, more than 80% of the women who received the vouchers actually put their child in childcare. And even though childcare also went up among the control mothers because the children were getting older, the differential was about 25%. So that's quite large. In terms of employment, we found that women who were provided voucher were 8.5 percentage points more likely to participate in some form of remunerated or income generation activity, which almost accounts for that 10% gap that we saw nationally. So that's giving you a sense of how large that impact is. And I think I'll leave it there.
Okay. This isn't your only chance, so we'll get to hear
Yep.
more from you on this. This is really interesting research, so thank you for that. So I'm actually going to go next to Maria. I'm going to kind of keep it a little fresh, not go exactly down the line, keep things unexpected. It is after lunchtime on the last day of Women Deliver. So Maria, I'm hoping you can tell all of us about what motivated your research on Mexico's full-time school programs, and also what are some key results that this program had and the impact it had on job creation and maternal employment.
Okay, well, I started studying the full-time schools program in Mexico because I care a lot about inequality, and I'm very interested in understanding the sources of inequality and what can we do, like how can we provide data-driven evidence to advise policy making. So when I learned about the full-time schools program in Mexico that started in 500 schools in 2007, but by now there are more than 25,000 schools all over Mexico. There are more than 3 million Mexican kids that are in a full-time schools nowadays. So pretty much what it did, it increased the length of the school day from 4.5 to 8 hours, pretty much providing with free childcare for most of the day. So I saw an opportunity to explain part of the gender gap in labor force participation, which around the world is about 26 percentage points. This gap is even larger in many developing countries and even larger for women with children. So there are many things, like it could be either gender norms or stereotypes or the lack of childcare institution or high quality childcare. So many times women are put in the position where you have to choose whether to have a family or to have children, but these two shouldn't be mutually exclusive. Like we should be able to choose both if we want to. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, what we do is, well, let's study this implicit childcare subsidy through full-time schooling. And what we find is that increasing the length of the school day does increase female labor participation. It increases employment. It also increases the number of hours worked a week. And more importantly, it increases earnings for women with children. So these effects are even larger for women living in poverty. Mm-hmm. And there is very interesting results that these effects spill over into working age grandmothers. So working age grandmothers also see an increase in participation. So at least in Mexico, 51% of children with working mothers are taken care of by their grandmothers. So at the end of the day, like all of this, what this is telling us is that more and better quality of childcare could be one of the key mechanisms to close this gap in participation in the labor force.
Great, thank you for that. That's really interesting, and I love that it's also looking at impact on grandmothers as well, because I think a lot of times when you're talking about gender data and statistics on women, we're talking usually about a very specific group of women up to a certain age, and there's a lot of interaction all through the life course. As I continue to age, I appreciate that openness. So thank you for that. So we've gotten here two great examples from some partners in academia on the work that they've done. And I'd like to turn now to hear a bit about the role that the private sector has. So I'm going to turn to Sandra for that. And I'd really like to hear about, what role you see the private sector as having in addressing the unequal burden of care, and what kinds of initiatives has Unilever been undertaking?
Yeah, so thank you. So Unilever, well, the private sector has a key role. Unilever itself normally thinks about gender equality across kind of various different ways. 3 in particular are within our workplace. So within kind of the workplaces that we have, our offices, within our value chain, and also through our brands, which we know have a huge impact because of the kind of communications capabilities that they actually have to leverage and kind of help shift mindsets. Quite specifically around unpaid care work, the private sector, as I mentioned, as an employer for many of the people that are here and around the world, it has that ability to start to use policies and practices to start to create those shifts that are needed. So it can start to develop and start to use role models to really kind of make sure that those policies are being taken up. So for as an example, paternity leave. Unilever has got a 3-week now global mandate on its paternity leave. And as our CEO who was here yesterday said, putting the policy in place is an easy part. Actually getting them to take it is the second part. So there is that ability to be able to start to shift things in terms of how men and women within that private sector start to think as to what responsibility they have, what ability and how it's being facilitated, what's the enabling environment that the private sector can actually create for men and women and families by doing those pieces. In addition to that, and at least kind of within what Unilever has as its assets, it has that ability to use its brands to be able to start to also shift those mindsets. So as we saw there, obviously one of the biggest things is that social norms piece. And we have that ability to use the communication elements of our brands to start to do that. So for example, again, yesterday, Government Plus Care talked about some of its initiatives, but it is a brand that has really started to make mainstream the idea of fathers caring, which should not seem like something that is beyond our understanding. We should be able to understand, but it's using that idea of communicating, the idea of, it's launched a corporate task force to get more companies involved in understanding how can they do and what can they do to champion paternity leave. But that is just one example of just how it's leveraging it. We have other brands, Sif and Sunlight, who are also using their advertising ability to be able to start to normalize how men and women both taking care of the household, both cleaning the kitchen, both it's those small shifts and nuances that communication, getting that into the mainstream, can really start to then just help broaden that perspective as to actually what is expected of me, and this feels quite normal. The more you see it, the more you start to just open that. So that's just 2 of the kind of key ways as employers and through the power of the brands to communicate those shifts.
Great, thank you for that. I'm so glad that we're getting to bring that perspective in of not only, because I think a lot of times when we talk about private sector solutions, some of it is about the workplace base, right? But all of the ability that brands have to really have a longer fingers into the kinds of positive change that we're hoping to make. So last, I'm going to turn back to a civil society colleague and to Thalia, and although civil society with a heavy research orientation, right, I should say. So how have local assessments of care and the household care survey strengthened advocacy in the Philippines as part of your livelihood and resilience program? And what changes are women and youth reporting as a result of that work?
Thank you. Yes. So I am going to present a different take on evidence in terms of how it can be used for advocacy, and also from the perspective of local organizations and development projects, which is different than some of the national economic policy advocacy that you and others are involved with. The We Care program started in 2013, and it was specifically working with enterprise and markets development programs in agriculture. And many of these program teams were asking for a low-cost, user-friendly, non-expert means of assessing unpaid care in order that women could benefit more and participate more in the programs, and that also that they could do something about care in their cooperatives or their projects or their villages. And the rapid care analysis, and I think there are some copies on the back table. It looks like this, and it's also available online, was the result. It's a qualitative focus group exercise. It uses only about 15 to 20 women and men and youth and leaders who come together for one day and start with a time use estimate and then identify what is problematic about unpaid care in their context and then brainstorm solutions. And what's worked really brilliantly across 23, 25 countries and far beyond the reach of Oxfam is that by the end of the day, the 20 people, women and men and leaders, really own the data, and they believe in their own estimates of time, even though this is not a random sample and it's not very rigorous. And this context-specific data on unpaid care and time use is much more powerful than national estimates if there is a time use survey. And without fail shows very long and unequal hours for women. Oftentimes women 57 hours in the week on unpaid care, men 7 to 10 hours, things like that. And it really mobilizes women and men to act. So in Mindanao in 2013, for example, they took this data and went to the local governments, and local government units invested in domestic water systems that reached 17,000 people. And in Honduras, the regional government invested $100,000 in a electric generating plant in rural mountain towns. And the other piece that we found really critical is that, of course, governments all over the world are doing water and energy investments, but it's often with a logic about health or economic productivity. In this case, the men themselves were coming up and saying this is about women's empowerment, it's about gender equality, it's about getting out of poverty because of unpaid care. The household care survey that you mentioned was then motivated by the local projects to say we need to be able in our projects to see what works and do the baseline and the end line. So it combines time use surveys and in this way rigorous quantitative surveys with a social norms module, with access to the government's infrastructure and services, and the presence or lack thereof of household time-saving equipment. And what we've been able to see is that having these factors all in one survey means that you can really see which factors are more powerful in making the change or not making a change in that local area. And without fail, time and again, we found that it is a combination of interventions that are the most powerful in making change. So one intervention on its own, like fuel-efficient stoves, you have fuel-efficient stoves and then women are expected to cook more. So it doesn't actually have the hours go down. But if you do the equipment and the services and the infrastructure and the social norms together, we have found both women reducing their unpaid care hours and more equal hours. Mm-hmm. So that's really been very powerful. The exception that I want to say is in isolated rural communities, access to improved water sources by itself has been correlated with 1 to 4 hours reduced per day on women's care hours. So if you have very little public infrastructure, this can be a very powerful thing on its own. And I'll talk about government action a little later.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I especially like how you pulled out the theme of, that we can all have the programmatic interventions that we've studied that we can say this works really well, but you're making the case for, a much more comprehensive approach and the need for those things to be complementing each other instead of, do this program over here and do this program over here. So I really appreciate that point, as well as, kind of bringing into the conversation some of the qualitative aspects of this type of research. So not to say that we don't always continue to need quantitative research that's occurring within national statistical offices and other areas, but that qualitative research also plays and community-based research plays an important role in terms of explaining the dynamics, I think, around some of these trends. So thank you for that. So I have one more set of questions for each person before running to Q&A. And this time I'm going to turn to Maria first, which is that I'm sure many people have been hearing in other sessions as well about the importance of investing in childcare, and that there's really compelling research on the benefits of investing in childcare. And we can know that in a vacuum, that's an important investment. But on the other hand, there's paying for childcare and for quality childcare. And so I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about Mexico's experience of this and how that can be realistically replicated in other countries.
Okay. Well, in the case of Mexico, like when you think about expanding on education and this program that is huge in terms of all of the resources that you need, you might think that this is an expensive program. So it actually increases the expenditure per student by about 18% in Mexico. And what you have to do when thinking on whether this policy is cost effective or not, like you have to take into consideration like both short and long-term outcomes. There is evidence from other full-time schools programs in Latin America, like Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, and Mexico, that this extension of the school day of full-time schools do increase labor force participation, but it also improves students' academic outcomes. It reduces the probability of teenage pregnancy. It reduces criminal crime. So at the end of the day, what you have to do, you have to outweigh the costs and the benefits, but you have to look into both. So when thinking about female employment, for every 100 children in a full-time schools, there is 6 new jobs for women. And there is actually this new report by the International Labor Organization that what they find is that if we do increase the expenditure in care work by 100%, there is going to be 269 million new jobs. So at the end of the day, the key for the implementation is quality, and it is also a targeted implementation whenever there is limited resources.
Great, thank you for that. It's really helpful to start thinking about how we can extend some of those learnings to other places as well. One just kind of commercial break is for the Slido, for the questions. Make sure that as you're looking at those, I believe there's a way to be liking some of those questions, a thumbs up. We're all about the thumbs up today. It's great. I'm just going to walk around like this for the rest of the day. If you can thumbs up some of them, that will help because, so that we can prioritize questions when it comes time to answering them. So thank you for that. Okay, so now I'm going to turn back to Thalia, actually, and you kind of started to give a little preview of this at the end of your other answer, but I'm hoping you could give, an example of a successful community intervention in the Philippines to reduce the care workload for women, and particularly how has the government or even companies been involved in some of these interventions?
Okay. Yes, I'm going to give several different ideas. One of the things I'm seeing it on the questions about how to get men and boys involved as well. And there's been in the Philippines some really wonderful work done about men and women and LGBTQI members being trained as We Care champions. And I think 2,000 have been trained, reaching 60,000 other men and boys and women. And the youth have also worked considerably on competitions in schools about care, young men and boys posting on social media that they're learning how to sweep or cook or wash or other things like that. And in addition, there has been a really fabulous TV advert, and it's been pushed out on social media and Facebook as well, that's called I Laba You. And so that's I love you, but laba is also the colloquial term for laundry. And it's a 1 minute
that is love.
Cute little story about a man who decides to re-romance his wife by washing with her. So if you look at I Laba You, you'll find it. Anyway, 29 million people have seen that I Laba You campaign, and it's been put on TV and retweeted by celebrities. It's really going quite well. In addition, actually with the support of Unilever, there's been a lot of work on water and laundry points, which has really reduced the number of hours that the rural families are spending on those two parts of unpaid care work. And 3 municipalities in the Philippines have been motivated, their city councils and their mayors, to pass a law called a We Care Ordinance. We did not push the branding, but there it was, which says that all city planning and budgeting must take unpaid care into account. And so they've started to invest 5% of city resources in care services. And on a national level, the Philippine Statistics Authority with the women's rights organization PKKK has been working to increase the statistics using the household care survey about what is working, what are the factors for more heavy or less heavy or more or less unequal care work in different provinces of the country. So that's it's been quite successful and working well at a local level and making inroads into the national level as well.
Well, I laba that answer. That's a great answer. Now I'm just like, how can I integrate laba into everything? That's great. Thank you for that. So I'm going to turn back to Sandra, actually. And I think, we got to hear a bit about what Unilever is up to. I think, Unilever's been active on a number of social initiatives. But I'd like to get your thoughts on how we can influence other private sector actors to really step up on this issue. What else is needed, and what can those of us in the various communities that we sit in do to help in engaging more private sector?
So one of the things that I think is going to be quite important is actually to help demystify probably actually what unpaid care is beyond the kind of the academic or the kind of the circles that are within that focusing on women's economic empowerment. There's it's not automatically a term that actually people understand or know what it means, but actually I think once you start to break it down, then actually it's quite obvious in terms of understanding where the private sector could potentially get involved, including, for example, practices and policies like we've mentioned before with paternity leave. This is the moment where I do the plug for the report, which talks about the business case for unpaid care. So it's a business briefing that we worked with Oxfam on as partners on this. And what it has tried to do is really help also help businesses understand actually what is the business brief, the benefits for this. So for example, kind of more engaged employees, retention, there's a figure around the 77% of potential employees are swayed by the fact that a company might have paternity or maternity leave. So there are benefits to this. It's just, I think that there's an element of not necessarily understanding what are those potential intervention points. So what this document here tries to do is be able to be almost a kind of a simple guide in terms of A, what is unpaid care work? B, what are the potential kind of interventions that you might be able to actually do? And then C, these are some examples of other companies and what they've actually done to be able to do this. So in some cases, it does talk about the innovations that they've put in place. In some of them, it's about those policies, the way that they've used communications. So there are lots of various examples beyond what Unilever's done that have been hugely successful in terms of being able to start to shift, again, that mindset piece, which we all know is incredibly important. So I think that starting to mainstream almost that conversation around unpaid care work and not trying to almost take it out and away from just within these circles, and just that demystifying piece, I think is just quite important, so that then actually everyone can then start to understand, okay, paternity leave, for example, is a very simple, and assuming that you can put a kind of a take it or lose it, or take it or lose it type of a piece in place, then that can be kind of quite simple things that actually any organization can start to put in place. So yeah, this document hopefully tries to summarize some of those.
Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just
No,
actually one last piece. From a private sector piece also, there is also the that piece around the communications element. There is an example of the Unstereotype Alliance, which actually the UN Women has convened, which lots of various different organizations can support and get involved with, which also goes on to understand actually how do they start to take stereotypes away from any advertising, and how do they start to make that step forward so that they are progressive? And so then that's another kind of example in terms of how private sector can get involved.
Thank you for that. I feel like you're also making a case for rebranding unpaid care. We're thinking about, yes. So maybe you know some people who can help with that. But thank you for that perspective. And so I'm going to turn last to Sonia and hear, in your view, what are some of the promising interventions to improve childcare and other dependent care options in low and middle income contexts, but also what policy recommendations, and this is a little bit coming out in some of the questions that we're seeing here, but what policy recommendations would you share with decision makers?
Okay, thanks. So two things here. I think it's important, first of all, to mention that policymakers very often have some quite rightly, justified concerns about subsidizing programs in general, in particular when it comes to potential disincentive effects. And I think it's important to address those and to think about that. There are two potential areas of concern here. One, of course, subsidizing childcare essentially reduces the cost of having children. And so one concern that policymakers might have is, well, in this case, especially in settings where we already have very high fertility rates, is subsidizing childcare going to lead to women actually having even more children? So this is something that does need to be addressed. Well, it turns out that we did actually ask in our survey mothers who participated in the program and mothers who were part of the control whether or not what their fertility intentions were. And actually, we found absolutely no difference between voucher and control. So that concern can be put to rest. The other concern is that subsidies might actually lead to a reduction in the number of hours worked for working moms. And well, we did ask about that, and it turns out for single mothers, we did find a slight reduction in number of hours worked, though, importantly, we saw no reduction in their earnings. Okay, so this is important. First of all, to note that we're talking about single moms who are working way in excess of 40 hours a week. So reduction in hours isn't necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, the fact that they're not seeing a reduction in their earnings goes to suggest a couple of things. One, they could be working more productively, say if they're self-employed, or it could be that they're getting access to better jobs where you have to work 40 hours a week, which is also when the daycare centers are open. So we think that these results are really quite important to sort of dissuade some of the fears that policymakers might have in introducing these sorts of subsidies. I guess some of the other things to think about, sort of big picture policy, is that the degree to which subsidized childcare services are really going to allow for productive engagement in the labor market is really going to largely depend on what that labor market looks like. In some setting, like in Korogocho, opportunities for high-paying, high-skilled, reliable, steady jobs, they're few and far between, right? And in fact, a lot of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship programs tend to fail largely because, well, once they've received this training, they have to stay home with the kids and not actually take advantage of that and benefit from that. And so in the long term, probably some of the most, I think, promising programs are those programs that have already been discussed, and in particular, Unilever. I think, when we were in the field, we did talk to local industry players, and there is a lot of consideration to try to bring childcare into the workplace. On the one hand, this is a win-win situation, right? On the one hand, moms can feel secure knowing that their child is right nearby, right, being cared for well, and they can also be more productive, and so the employer is going to be benefiting from this as well. Of course, this being said, governments also do have a potential role to play here to try to facilitate those sorts of arrangements that combine the workplace with childcare.
Excellent. Thank you for that, and some real practical recommendations, and also some myth busting, which I think is always welcome and helpful. So I think now we're going to turn to audience Q&A, and the Slido has really helpfully organized some of the top questions. But do we have a mic if I were to ask a volunteer of whoever was the author? Oh, thanks, Becca. Are you gonna? Whoever was the author of the original question, we're gonna go in order based on the thumbs upping. Whoever wrote the question, if you could raise your hand. The first question is, there we go. This lady right over here. And could you introduce yourself and where you're from, too?
Sure.
That'd be great. Thanks.
I'm Ivy Bourgeot from the University of Ottawa, Canada. So I was thinking about it, especially the title of the session, right? And it's not really going to be enticing anybody to do that. And I think it's also about valorizing the work that women do and not portraying it as a burden and as drudgery. So there's two edges to that, both valorizing the work, but also how are we going to market this, for men? They've got to see something positive in it.
Mm-hmm. Great. We'll take the first three and then turn it to the panel. So whoever did the second question has the behavior change intervention. Great.
Hi, I'm Susan Bell. I'm from Chemonics International in the U.S. I wanted to hear from you all about your experience of doing behavior change communications and engagement with men and boys, connected to that of how do we engage them in this work and sort of degendering it. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Excellent question. And then let's take the data use question.
Hi, I'm Anne from Equal Measures 2030. So this is a very on-brand question for me, I guess. So I just wanted to hear a bit from any of you on specific anecdotes of data that you have found useful in advocacy with policymakers.
Great, thank you. So we'll take those three first, and then I'm going to kick it over to the panel on better marketing it not as drudgery. I also was thinking about that with the panel title as well. So I might actually just start. I'm going to put you on the hook since you have probably a pretty robust marketing department at Unilever, I'm guessing. No, but it would be great to hear, and I would love other perspectives as well. But how could we do that? Whether it's calling it unpaid care or calling it drudgery, what are different ways of vocabulary we could be using to be more inclusive?
This reminds me also just of, I went to visit the program in the Philippines, we've got the We Care program in the Philippines with Oxfam. and we asked some, I remember asking them and about even just the term unpaid care, how did they feel about that? And for them, there's such pride in what they do as well, that it's just, there is something there, I think, around that kind of communications piece. To be able to engage more people around it, but then also just to be able to start to take away this sense that it is drudgery. It is a responsibility, essentially, that men and women have to both equally take part in. So at least from that communications perspective, at least from a marketing piece, we are trying, or there is that ability to be able to look at the pride that actually people feel often when they clean the kitchen, when they look after the kids, the happiness, etc. There's so many additional benefits beyond the actual task in itself, and I think that there's ways in which we can use that communication power to really start to bring those things to life. But I think that piece around, yes, there's a communications challenge there of broadening this out so that people understand that it's a responsibility, it's not drudgery, it's a responsibility that equally needs to be taken by both men and women. So yeah.
Great. Thalia, you look like you have a comment. Yes, as well.
This is something that I've worked on quite a while. Yes, in fact, Oxfam tries not to use the word burden because we want more care. We want more care of people, more quality care. It is not a burden. We do distinguish between care of people and domestic work because a lot of domestic work is very difficult, arduous, and isolating. And so that's the drudgery part. And I think that the SDG formulation of unpaid care and domestic work does help us to actually separate out care of people from domestic work. With the help of some of Unilever's marketing people, when we were trying to figure out what slogans we might come up with, ended up with care work is teamwork. And that's a really strong slogan in the Philippines. We also have seen all over the world that there is a perception that care work, not only is it not work, it's sort of helping or something, but that it's petty work or easy work or light work, which is far from the truth. So really promoting an understanding that caring for people is skilled work, and even household tasks are skilled work.
Great. Thank you. Are we good? Is there anybody else? Okay. I feel like you both said it very well. So next, wanted to hear from some of you about behavior change interventions on unpaid care with men and boys. Maria, have you worked on this? No. At all? Okay. No? Okay. I'm turning. No? Anyone? Maybe you've worked on this. Although actually maybe that's kind of an interesting finding in and of itself. But so Thalia or Sandra, in the work that you're doing, can we talk a bit about, you talked a little bit about it with
there's I mean, the We Care program in itself is, and Thalia knows this more than anyone else, is it focuses on those 3 R's: the reduction, the redistribution, and the recognition. And that piece around the redistribution is so hugely important that we're not going to shift anything without men being at the table on this discussion. But quite specifically in terms of program elements around that, I will defer to the expert.
I think am I on? Yes, okay. I think I will also mention one of our strong allies, Men Care and Promundo, that have been working on for years on a program called Program P about responsible fatherhood. That's a very strong piece. What we have found also is that making for boys and young men the idea of learning these skills as being something that they can take pride in. They're more self-sufficient. They know how to cook. They know how to take care of themselves. And we in Colombia we had a celebrity chef who was doing cooking programs with adolescent men and took a video of them then serving their mothers with what they cooked with a celebrity chef. And then that video was shown in secondary schools and as trailers for movie theaters and things like that. So there's lots of ways, actually. The thing I wanted to emphasize the most is that by engaging men as well as women in working on unpaid care at whatever level, across many religions, across many contexts, we hardly ever get pushback. And it works to include unpaid care with men and women as a poverty issue, as a social justice issue in all kinds of different communities, and to bring together the traditional chiefs, the religious leaders, great quotes from imams and Catholic priests. And I mean, this is not an issue just for women.
Thank you for that. And I think Sonia remembered something.
Well, actually, we did collect some data. We just haven't had a chance to look at it thoroughly. But I just want to sort of come back to this notion. It's sort of something to be a little concerned about with subsidized childcare. Right? If this allows women to participate in the labor market, there's a concern that in addition now to working a full day, they go home and have another full day of work. Right? So there's this notion of double shift, right? Second shift. That's actually been documented here in Canada, in fact. One of your colleagues at the University of Ottawa has a paper with a colleague at UQAM documenting this. And so this is where changing these gender norms are going to be very important to try to equalize that second shift. So.
It's interesting because there's also been research by a colleague who has been looking at women's entrepreneurship and growing of businesses and sort of measuring the stress around that. Chris Murray, I think. No, Chris, I'm forgetting his last name. I'll figure it out and I'll let you know. But anyway, really interesting work around in the women's entrepreneurship space. You're kind of measuring business growth, right? But you're not measuring whether or not the female entrepreneur wants her business to grow. Sometimes it's measurements of stress in terms of this double shift piece that's going on at home, that it's like, I actually want to keep my business exactly where it is. And that doesn't mean it's not successful. It means that I'm kind of choosing that for my own reasons. So I think there's a really interesting interaction with the economic empowerment space on some of this as well. So I want to turn to the last question that was asked in this round on what data that you have found really useful for advocating with policymakers.
Okay.
Please.
So the data on time use isn't very good. And I would say, like, as Sonia mentioned, like, this happened like not only in developing countries, but around the world. When thinking about good data or how to make a point with data to inform policymakers, I would say that we need to create some sort of longitudinal panel where we can observe people's behavior over time, so that you see whenever you have an intervention what happened after the intervention in terms of time use. So most of the data that exists currently can be used mostly to provide statistics. So overall, we have, for example, in Mexico, women work on unpaid work like 3 times more than men do. And then it's like this is even lower for childcare. It's like in general they do other stuff like fixing the roofs of the houses or doing manly work, but they don't do like other stuff.
Thank you. Do you have a comment on this?
Sure. Just to echo a lot of this, time use surveys are really hard. They're, the number of hours don't add to 24 in a day, and that's a huge concern in terms of how you do this. So, kudos to the work that you've all been doing on this. I think in our case we collected our own data because we needed the data to match the needs of our project. And I think, given that we were able to combine both quantitative and qualitative, and I think we had a fairly solid and rigorous study. happy that I think the policymakers were able to benefit from that, even though it wasn't necessarily a very large sample with lots of data that's equally easily comparable. So I would say just to continue pushing on both long comparable data time series, but also isolated studies that can go deeper into the particular questions.
And also, I think thinking about things like tools like light time use surveys. So this is something we've been talking about with and working on. Certainly, the ILO has been a leader on this, along with the UN Statistics Division, around based on modules that do exist, or based on surveys that do exist, like labor force surveys, for instance. Countries are already going to be doing labor force surveys. So how do we institute, a time use module, a light time use module? It's always like the irony of time use surveys is how much time they take for the people who are having to, and who already have a time burden, there's all of that, which we could talk about too, but we don't have time. I think, that's also kind of important to think about, of what are the ways we can work within the systems that we have to better reflect some of this. And the other thing I would just kind of say, to kind of flip this a little bit, in terms of not only, I have this data and now I'm going to talk policymakers into what I want to do because I have this data. It's also figuring out, and we found this a bit in our time use survey analysis, of where the conditions are right for the policymaker to be influenced by the data, so that there's a question or a challenge within a country that a policymaker is trying to solve, and then partnering with others to ensure that time use data is then collected and utilized. And we have this example that we've documented from Uruguay, where this happened, where it was a coalition, and I think that's part of what's interesting about the makeup of this panel, of academics as well as civil society, who were very motivated, who knew, everyone knew that there was an imbalance in terms of this type of work, valuable work that was happening, but that there was a gender imbalance. And so there was a push from academia and civil society to collect this information, and then partnership that happened with policymakers. And at the same time, policymakers in Uruguay were seeing that there was a challenge around labor force participation among women, as well as some interaction. And they just needed the information. And then, because there had been this coalition of actors and work going on time use surveys, those two pieces were able to come together. And so I think, thinking about it that way, not just we need to generate the data and then come and hand it on a platter to policymakers, not to say that that's not also helpful sometimes, but that also if we can be thinking differently about how we engage policymakers from the get-go and be a bit more maybe policy responsive, and thinking about, these are people who have jobs where they're trying to solve problems just like we're trying to solve problems. So how do we kind of shift our own thinking about that? I think is also good to consider. So I think that at this point we're going to need to wrap up, because people are probably trying to go to other sessions. I just do want to give, I know there were more questions here, and maybe some of our panelists can mill about, but do just want to give a shout out to this anonymous person on changing the mindset of women as well. I think it's a really interesting point. Yeah, so snaps for that person, whoever that was. Thank you. You can raise your hand, or I'll clap for you. But I think I think it is a really interesting point, and I'm flagging it partially because of the conversation we had around how do we rebrand some of these things? How do we think about these more inclusive? Maybe we're being exclusionary, and kind of deepening the problem sometimes ourselves, certainly not intentionally, but that this is about men's empowerment too, in this sense that men are capable of doing these things, and I always think about it, sometimes I get very stressed out when I travel, and I had an older female colleague tell me once, like, maybe you just need to stop trying to be so controlling of how your husband, makes the peanut butter sandwich or whatever it is. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. Like, it was completely, like, it was innocent, but it was a really good check, I think, for me. And maybe it's just the kind of thing to also be thinking about as a community, as well as how we shift our own mindset on this. So I'm very grateful to each of our panelists for sharing their experience today. Amazing women that we have here. I also really want to deeply thank our co-organizers for this session, ILO, IDRC, and Oxfam Canada, for their partnership, and especially for all of you in the work that you're doing every day and will continue to do. So thank you so much.